So we're going to spend some time talking about cell communication. So in this body that we have, in order for it all to work together and to function, we need to have communication. And the way that happens is via cell-to-cell communication. So there are a couple of different ways that we do this. We're going to talk about two different ways that we do this. And we do this overall using chemical messengers. So we have our chemical messengers. And there are two different types of chemical messengers, or two different categories that we're going to talk about. First, we'll talk about the neurotransmitters. And then we'll talk about hormones. So if you can think for a moment about which systems we're talking about when we're talking about these. So which system do you think we're talking about when we're talking about neurotransmitters? So the giveaway is the neuro part. So we're talking about the nervous system. Right, so we'll talk about the nervous system and how neurotransmitters work, and then hormones, what system will we be talking about in general for that? The endocrine system, right? And then other systems as well. So we have some coming from the digestive system, some coming from other systems, but overall we're talking about the endocrine system because we're talking about the endocrine glands, or endocrine organs. So let's take a closer look at these. In general, we have these chemical messengers, as we said, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about with cell communication. If we remember what a cell looks like, remember we have our plasma membrane, we have our phospholipid bilayer. I'm going to draw some of these, and then I'm just going to kind of assume this is part of the bilayer here, right? So we can pretend that this is the bilayer and this is the bilayer. And then recall that within the bilayer, we have many, many things. Some of which are proteins. All right, so we have proteins that are embedded in our plasma membrane. We have some that are going throughout the plasma membrane, so transmembrane proteins, and then we have some that are kind of on the edge, up here attached to our transmembrane proteins, which are peripheral proteins. When we're talking about cell communication, what we're going to be talking about then are these transmembrane proteins. And when we're talking about cell communication, we're talking about them as receptors. So these are going to be our receptors that are embedded inside of our plasma membrane. So these chemical messengers are actually going to bind to the receptors, which are these proteins, and these proteins have special shapes. So on the edge here, on the outside edge here, we are going to have specific shapes. Now this is similar to an enzyme where it has a very specific shape. So if we have our different molecules out here, let's say we have our molecules floating around, whatever molecule this is. We could say this is epinephrine. And then let's say we have another molecule out here. Of course, these are just simple, crude drawings, just so we can discuss these different things. Let's say this is cortisol. So we have these molecules out here, right? We have our hormones, our neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about the difference in just a moment. But if you'll notice that they are different shapes. And so our receptors are specific to a certain type of chemical messenger. And it fits just like an enzyme, like a lock and a key situation. So the receptors are embedded in the plasma membrane, and then we'll have our little molecule, our chemical messenger, bind to our receptor, and then that's going to send a message throughout the cell and going to initiate some sort of change. Now, we can have them embedded in the cell like we just talked about here, or sometimes, depending on the type, we can go in here and we can have our receptor actually inside of our cell. And that would really depend on the type of chemical messenger that we're talking about here. So if this is our chemical messenger here, let's say, for example, just because these are the things we drew, well, maybe not cortisol, because cortisol is a bad example of that. That's not actually a nonpolar one. But anyway, so we have our receptor. Our receptor can be on the plasma membrane or embedded within the plasma membrane, or it can be within the cell. So this would be an example of a receptor that's within the cell. And then in that case, we can just discuss that now. A receptor that would have a chemical messenger that's going to bind to it. In this case, if it's going to be binding to a receptor in the plasma membrane, this is because this particular chemical messenger would be polar. So if it's polar, it can be floating around in the bloodstream, not a problem, and then it can bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell. It would not then go through the plasma membrane because, remember, this is a non-polar region. So it wouldn't go through the plasma membrane in order to affect some sort of change inside of the cell. So it has to stay outside of the cell and attaches to a transmembrane protein receptor on the plasma membrane. On the other hand, there are some chemical messengers that can go through our plasma membrane. These would be chemical messengers that are non-polar. A non-polar chemical messenger, let's say like estradiol, another hormone, that can go through this non-polar layer here of the plasma membrane, and then it can go in and it can affect a change in a receptor that's inside of the cell or within the cell, and it actually goes into the nucleus as well. So we have the two different types of chemical receptors. In general, we're talking about neurotransmitters and we're talking about hormones, but then within those categories we can talk about polar chemical messengers and non-polar chemical messengers. So the polar ones are going to attach to our transmembrane proteins, and then our non-polar can go through the plasma membrane and affect within the cell. So then once our messenger binds to the receptor, some sort of change is going to occur in the cell. So this means that the message has been sent. So we have an attachment and then some sort of change will occur. So the first one, let's talk about some specifics here of the neurotransmitters. So our neurotransmitter. Our neurotransmitter, again, we're talking about our nervous system. And so we're talking about our neurons. When we talk about our neurons, this is the nervous system cells, and they have an ending, and we're going to see this more when we actually get to the nervous system, but it's important to understand the difference between these cell signaling ahead of time. So typically our neurotransmitters, they don't travel very far. They have a local effect, meaning that they go from one cell and then they'll go to the cell right next to them. So this is the end of a cell here, the end of a neuron. And then this is the beginning or another part of a different neuron. Okay, so our neurotransmitters are going to cause other neurons to send signals, or it's going to send a signal to another neuron, for example. So when we think about our neurotransmitters, right, so if we think about our neuron, we're going to be sending an electrical signal through our neuron. Okay, this is very basic. We'll talk about more details when we get to the nervous system. So we send our electrical signal through the neuron. It gets to the end here, which we'll talk about. And then what this does is it causes a change here. And we're going to see that this is going to have little holes here in our neuron. And then we're going to have these gaps that open up, little gates that'll open up and release our neurotransmitter. So our neurotransmitter is going to leave the first neuron. We'll call this the first neuron. There is an electrical impulse that's sent down the neuron, and it's going to cause our little neurotransmitter molecules or ions to go out of this cell through little pores that open up, or little gates that open up, and it's going to go through this little cleft here. This is actually called the synaptic cleft. It'll go through the synaptic cleft, and then it's going to bind to little receptors on the next neuron cell. So these neurotransmitters are going to be released from the first neuron, and then it goes through this small space, the synaptic cleft. Again, this is why it's a local effect, and then it's going to attach to our receptors on the next neuron. When it does this, then we send that message along through the cell. That electrical impulse is going to continue, and then it'll go all the way through that cell to the next cell. And then we'll, again, when it gets to the end of this, we'll call this the second neuron, then we'll see the same thing happening that we see happening here, where this second neuron now is going to release the neurotransmitters. They're going to go through the synaptic cleft between the second neuron and we'll say the third neuron now. And then it'll make a message continue on through the third neuron. Another place that we see neurotransmitters are actually between nervous system cells and muscle cells. So a similar ending here. So we have our nervous system cell here, our neuron. And then we have our impulse going down. When our impulse goes down through the nervous system cell, we'll just draw the same little neurotransmitter, is going to go out through some gates there, and then it's going to go through the synaptic cleft, and then it's going to attach to receptors on what is now a muscle cell rather than a nervous system cell or a neuron. Once they attach to the receptors on our muscle cell, then we're going to be sending a signal for muscle contraction. Okay, and we'll of course get into more detail as we go on throughout the semester. So we see neurotransmitters going from a neuron cell to another neuron cell, and then from a neuron cell, which is this up here, to a muscle cell, for example. So those are our neurotransmitters. So now we're going to take a look at our hormones, because those are just a little bit different. So our neurotransmitters, again, are local. When we talk about our hormones, our second type of chemical messenger, this is, again, our endocrine system. And they're going to be secreted by our different endocrine cells. So our endocrine cells, or our glands. And our hormones are unlike our neurotransmitters in that they can go long distances. So again, our neurotransmitters are going to go from one neuron to another neuron, or from one neuron to a muscle cell, but they're very, very close. They just have what's called that synaptic cleft, just that tiny space between them that they have to travel before they communicate with the next cell. But our hormones, they go long distances. So our hormones are actually released into body fluids. Released into our body fluids. So a lot of times we think of these as going through the bloodstream. So for example, our bloodstream, and going to places that are far, far away. So long distances in the bloodstream. So our endocrine system consists of different cells, different tissues that are going to make and then release these hormones. They're going to travel through body fluids, through the blood, and then they're going to get to their target cells. And of course, the hormone that is released, where it's released from and where it's going to, are going to be different depending on the situation and depending on the hormone. But once it gets to the target cell, we'll see the same thing where there's some sort of change in that cell. So when we talk about our hormones, we do have them released from the cell. So this is, let's say this is our cell here, this is our nucleus. We're going to have our hormones. Let's maybe do the diamond-shaped hormone. We'll talk about epinephrine first. So our hormones are going to leave the gland here. So we have these spaces or these gates that are going to allow our hormone to leave. Once it leaves, then it'll go to our target cell. So this is, let's pretend, our plasma membrane again of our target cell. We're going to have our space here with our protein, right? Our transmembrane protein. And then, actually, I should have left a little gap up here, because recall that we then have this little site of attachment here. And so again, remember that they are specific. We have our receptor proteins, and the chemical messenger is going to travel through our body fluids, right? Over here, we're talking about traveling through the blood. So this is coming from our original endocrine gland. And let's just take a specific example. So let's talk about epinephrine. So we're saying that this little guy here is epinephrine. Our epinephrine is going to be a polar molecule. And since it is a polar molecule or a polar hormone, it's going to go to a receptor that's sitting in the membrane, in the plasma membrane of its target cell. Let's say this is the target cell here. All right, so epinephrine is something that's released in our fight or flight situation. So let's say there's a tiger coming at you. You're going to need to run away. You're going to want to run away. So our adrenal glands here, our adrenal gland is our endocrine gland that is going to then release epinephrine. So you're in a situation where you have to fight, run away. So our adrenal glands kick in. They're going to release epinephrine, which is a hormone. Endocrine gland is releasing a hormone. That hormone then is going to travel through the bloodstream and get to its target cell. So its target cell here we'll talk about is the liver. So this is a liver cell. So our epinephrine travels along. It attaches to its receptor on the target cell, the liver cell, and then it's going to affect a change within the liver cell. So in this example, we're going to tell the liver cell, this epinephrine is going to attach here to the receptor. It's going to tell the liver cell to stop making glycogen. Remember, glycogen is our storage molecule of glucose, so it's telling it stop storing glucose and actually break it down so that we can use that glucose for energy. Send that energy out or send that glucose out so that we have more energy so we can keep running and getting away. Also, and this is just also kind of a side note to this hormone thing, is that hormones can work on multiple target cells. So the example we just used was going to the liver cell. It tells the liver to stop storing glucose and to actually send more glucose out so we have it for energy. But this same little epinephrine molecule can go over here and attach to a different transmembrane protein that's in the plasma membrane. I'm kind of overlapping here, but in the plasma membrane of the digestive system, or an intestinal cell. And in the intestinal cell, then it's going to decrease digestion. So when we're trying to run from a tiger, right, we don't want to be digesting our food. We want to put all of our blood and all of our energy into our muscles, for example, so that we can run away. So it's going to decrease digestion, and it's going to constrict our blood vessels. And then we also see epinephrine is going to go to muscle cells, right? So muscle cells, and it's going to increase our blood flow in the muscle cells so that we can get more glucose, so that we can get more energy, so we can keep running. So we see hormones go to multiple target cells. The idea here, though, is that we have an adrenal gland, or we have a gland, an endocrine gland that's going to release the hormone. It's going to attach to its receptor in the plasma membrane, and it's going to cause a change in that target cell. Now, we did mention, remember, that some of them are going to go to the receptor that's in the plasma membrane, and some of them are going to go inside of the cell. So an example of that, I'm just going to draw our plasma membrane again. This is our bilayer, of course. And then we have the receptor, or we have our transmembrane proteins, but we are not actually going to be talking about our transmembrane proteins as receptors in this case, because remember, we are talking about, let's use blue here. We are talking about a different type of hormone. In this case, we're talking about a non-polar hormone. So our non-polar hormones, let's use the example estradiol. So estradiol is released by the female reproductive system. And when this hormone is released, again, it can go through the plasma membrane, because remember, this is a non-polar region in here. And actually, while it's in the bloodstream, this is the blood out here, when it's in the bloodstream, it's attached to some other pieces that allow it to be soluble in the blood. Then it can release itself from these other proteins that allow it to be soluble, and then it can go through that plasma membrane because it's non-polar. And in fact, this one goes through the plasma membrane into the nucleus. That's what this guy is. This is our nuclear envelope plasma membrane that I've made right here. And when it does that, this is actually in our target cell, which I forgot to mention. So our target cell here, which again is a liver cell. So here we have our reproductive system, the female reproductive system releasing estradiol, which is a hormone. That hormone is a non-polar hormone, so it's going to go through the plasma membrane of our target cell, which is the liver cell. Once it does that, it's going to go into the DNA. Once it goes into the DNA, then it's going to actually turn on genes to make proteins. And those proteins are going to be specific to reproduction. So in this case, the hormone is released, estradiol, travels through the bloodstream again to a faraway place, right, all the way from the reproductive system to the liver cell, gets through that plasma membrane, through the nuclear envelope even, which is another plasma membrane, gets to the DNA, and it turns on the genes to make proteins that are needed for reproduction. So we just looked at two different types of hormones. So the type of hormone that can attach to a receptor on the outside of the cell, which would be a polar type of hormone because it can't get through the nonpolar bilayer, and then a nonpolar hormone. So just in summary here, remember we're talking about cell communication. We're talking about our chemical messengers. We have the neurotransmitters. We have our neurotransmitters, which come from the nervous system. We have our hormones, which come from the endocrine system. We talked about how we have the different types that can attach to receptors that are on the outside of the cell or on the plasma membrane. Those would be our polar chemical messengers. And then we have those that can go through and affect something within the cell. Our neurotransmitters are going to go from one neuron to another neuron. It's a local effect when we're talking about neurotransmitters in the nervous system, or it can go from a neuron to a muscle cell and have an effect within the muscle cell. Then, I kind of moved this so it's overlapping, but then we talked about hormones, and our hormones come from the endocrine system. See if I can move these down so they're not overlapping. There we go. Our hormones come from the endocrine system, our endocrine glands. So we have, for example, here the adrenal gland. We're releasing our hormone. The hormone goes to its target cell. It's going to attach to the receptor on the outside of the cell. In this example and in other examples, we have it going to multiple cells. So the liver cell, the digestive system, muscle cells, and has an effect on each one of those different effects, in fact. And then lastly, we looked at our nonpolar hormone, again traveling through the blood and then able to go through the plasma membrane into the nucleus and then have its change. So that's what we're talking about with chemical communication or cell communication with chemical messengers, is we're sending messages, and we can do that locally through the nervous system, or we can do that long distances through the endocrine system.